We are at one of the boundaries of Camp Douglas off of Martin Luther King Drive, where one of the memorial plaques are right here to the former camp. Now, Camp Douglas initially started out in 1861 as a camp to train Union soldiers for the war, but it eventually evolves into a prisoner camp. Last couple of years of its existence, about 1863 to 1865, is when it was a prisoner camp. And in that amount of time, there were about 20,000 Southern Confederate soldiers that were held in this camp. Some estimates say there could be 10,000 at any given time. Many believe close to 6,000 soldiers die at this camp. The conditions were very poor here. A lot of diseases swept through here, like cholera, smallpox. The barracks were small. They weren't well heated in the winter. By many reports, they were served rancid food, whatever the leftover scraps of Chicago was, the food that they got. A lot of these soldiers, having been from the South, were not used to the cold conditions we get here in the winter. They do bury some of the soldiers here, but there are still people to this day that say they see the ghost of soldiers roaming these grounds. Soldiers dressed in raggedy old clothing, because a lot of these soldiers only had 1 or 2 pairs of clothing, and the clothing and the shoes got very worn throughout the year. They say they still hear like the bugle call in the morning. One of the daughters of one of the captains here, Captain Sweet, she used to like to go around in the morning blowing the bugle and singing, "Are you all dead yet?" to the soldiers that were stationed here. I did a paranormal investigation with a group several years ago who got the right to do an investigation out here before they built some of it up, before they built the Lake Meadow Shopping Center, before they built some of these condos. And we did get some interesting results. I know they did capture some shadow figures and some recorded voices that sounded like old Union soldiers on the grounds here. This part of Camp Douglas right here, where this Culver's restaurant is, was where the smallpox cemetery was for the camp. There were a lot of diseases that swept through this camp. A lot of soldiers died here. It is believed, estimate about 600 were buried right where this Culver's is. There was a group several years ago, they're called the Camp Douglas Restoration Foundation, who have done a lot of research on Camp Douglas. They've actually dug up a lot of relics from around here of the camp. The guy who was running that organization urged the people not to build the culvers on this site, because this is the site he pinpointed as where the cemetery would have been. And not so much that it'd even be ghostly activity. There is that small chance that smallpox could still be active in the ground where those bodies are. Haven't heard too much about ghost stories from this culvers yet, but it's only a few years old. So we'll see as time goes on. Camp Douglas was initially built over the land called Oakenwald, which was the property of Senator Stephen A. Douglas. When Douglas died, he was buried in this portion of the property right here, under this memorial. If you walk up there, you can actually see where his body is entombed. If you're not familiar with Senator Stephen Douglas, he debated Abraham Lincoln. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were fairly well known at the time. They're still taught in history classes today. Douglas was for expanding slavery to new territories, like the new territories forming out west, like Kansas and Nebraska, where Abraham Lincoln was totally against expanding slavery. Eventually, once Lincoln defeated Douglas, he kind of came more on Lincoln's side. He still was for letting slave owners in the South keep their slaves, but he stopped being so much about expanding it to new territories, or up here to the north. Eventually, he died before the Civil War even ended, Stephen Douglas did, and he was buried here on this property. He would have died before this would have become the prisoner of war hell camp that it did.